in which at least 750,000 human beings, it's quite the UN, I believe, or the British, some people say it was 800,000. It may have been even higher than that. At least 3/4, pretty much of the entire Palestinian population was forced off their land, violently forced through extremely violent means, including a number of massacres. Much of this violence, and I believe half the massacres, occurred before Israel had even declared independence. So the myth, if any of you grew up with the myth of 5 Arab armies besieging little Israel, may not know that a great deal of the ethnic cleansing occurred before a single Arab army had joined the conflict, and that even once the Arab armies joined the conflict, the Arab and Palestinian forces were smaller in number and in weaponry, considerably smaller than the Zionist Israeli forces were. So there was a massive, what the Israeli historian Ilan Pappé has called ethnic cleansing. That really is the accurate term for what happened. These refugees, according to international law and according to international morality, have the right to return home. But Israel does not allow them to return to their homes. So this is one of the key factors in the conflict today, and it's a factor the U.S. media almost never talks about, but it's significant. Again, jumping ahead to hear some of the massacres during this period. To 1967, we find that Israel attacked, at the end of that war, Israel had conquered 78% of Palestine, so the Palestinians were down to 22%. Then in 1967, Israel again attacked its neighbors, as it did in every single war except for one. And in this case, they conquered the West Bank, the Golan Heights, and the Gaza Strip. These are occupied territories. They are not part of Israel, except for Israel decided to annex the Golan Heights. The people there don't agree to that, but that's what Israel did. The West Bank and Gaza Strip are occupied territories. They are not part of Israel. They are Palestinian territories. During this period, by the way, Israeli forces, this was the Six-Day War, also attacked a U.S. Navy ship operating in international waters, the USS Liberty. They killed 34 American servicemen, injured 174 of them. The decks were running with blood. This was, according to Admiral Thomas Moore, former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, this was an act of war by the State of Israel against the United States of America. And this was an act of murder against American servicemen. Again, according to Admiral Thomas Moore, testifying on Capitol Hill, I believe it was in 2003. I was there. Highly significant testimony not reported in the American media. If you look on our website, you will see it's in the Congressional Record. An op-ed by Admiral Moore was in the Stars and Stripes newspaper, and the Associated Press uncharacteristically actually did a story about that. Nevertheless, do a LexisNexis search and you just don't find, something like 10 newspapers out of hundreds reported anything to do with it. Since 1967, by the way, taking land by conquest is no longer legal under international law in today's world. In addition, moving your population onto that land, confiscating private land, kicking the people out, and putting your own population on is illegal. There is no doubt about this. And yet that is what Israel has been doing since 1967. Every single one of those red dots is an illegal Israeli colony on Palestinian land. The red dots in Gaza have been removed as they were required to be removed by international law. So those are no longer there. Instead, Gaza is just largely a prison. Israel controls the borders, the airspace, etc. So it no longer has those red dots. It's just one big prison. But the West Bank now increasingly, while those settlers were taken out of Gaza, the amount of land taken in the West Bank increased significantly, and the number of settlers that moved onto that land increased significantly. That also was not reported by our media. So there is a lot of context that is extremely important to know that our news media aren't telling us. When I began to look into this was all new to me back in 2001. I had not known this was going on. When I began to look into it more and more, after several months, it seemed to me that this was so significant that it seemed to me that if what I was starting to learn was true, then it appeared that our national interests and needs as a nation were the opposite of what we were being told, and our moral responsibilities as human beings were the opposite of what the media were leading us to believe. It seemed so important that I finally decided to quit my job and to go and see for myself. And so began the most unusual trip I've ever undertaken. Many years before, I had been in the Peace Corps in Afghanistan. In that case, I was taught the language, I was married, and I had a very official support system behind me, the Peace Corps. In this case, I was going to be traveling alone, and I had no support system whatsoever of any kind. As I landed on February 7th at 8 p.m., my return flight scheduled for 1 month later, I experienced a sudden pang of the disquiet I had been trying to ignore. What was it going to be like for me, as an American female, to wander alone through a Muslim land that was in the middle of a violent uprising and that was at the very epicenter of a region portrayed widely as extremely hostile to women in general and to Americans in particular? What was it going to be like? Well, as I wandered haphazardly and randomly throughout the Palestinian territories, throughout the West Bank and Gaza Strip, I discovered that once again, these are more myths about this region that are as untrue as they are widely held. I was welcomed and invited to stay in people's homes. I was treated with respect and completely safe, except when I came too near the Israeli military. I was welcomed whenever people heard that I was an American. The invariable response was welcome. And yet, this is what our media show us. Now they should. All of these pictures I'm showing you, I took myself, including these. This is what we see in our media that consistently reinforces Palestinians as terrorists, frightening images to us. If you look at this picture, sadly, I think I must have ruined the photograph that these photojournalists were taking because I was taking these pictures myself. This is a cardboard box that was being burned in what looks frightening in a funeral for a small boy who had been killed the day before. Now, yes, we should see these. I took them, I'm showing them to you. But it seems to me we should also see what most of the people looked like in that funeral. And this is what they looked like. This girl said to me, "Do you think we're all terrorists?" Because Palestinians know that's what Americans are led to believe about them. It seems to me we should see that there are, of course, still Christian Palestinians living there. You can meet them easily and ask them questions, as I did. I interviewed many, many people. That was my whole purpose of my trip. They all told me we are all Palestinians being pushed out by Israel. Muslims and Christians were just Palestinians. In this funeral, these were mixed. They're always mixed. Friends, friends working together, etc. This little boy, George, that was their son, he's holding a fragment of the missile that came through their home. His mother said he doesn't like his home anymore, and I understand why not. It's full of bullet holes. He's afraid to live there anymore. During my month of traveling throughout the Palestinian territories, I had found a population under siege. Throughout Gaza and the West Bank, I found that people were being kept virtually in prison. There were military checkpoints that limited and sometimes totally prevented you from leaving your town and going to the next town over. There were people living just outside. There were teenagers living just outside the incredible city, the religious and cultural center of that region, Jerusalem, who had never been in there. It's like having teenagers that are just outside of Cleveland that have never been into Cleveland because they're not allowed in. They're the wrong kind of people, and they're not allowed in. And by checkpoints, I don't mean toll booths or something. I mean armed soldiers in combat gear. In Gaza, I grew used to almost arriving at a street corner and finding young soldiers in tanks with fixed machine guns aimed straight at you. You hoped they waved you on rather than shooting you, as they had some people. At night, you couldn't really see the soldiers very well, but you saw the flashlight with which they signaled whether or not you were allowed to continue driving, to continue living. This was routine. But in some parts, there was more. It's sort of like here, some parts are less desirable areas to live in than others. In Palestine, they're being shelled, sometimes nightly. This is still going on. I went through residential areas that were bullet-riddled, with homes with large holes through the roofs and the walls. I found that if the people were lucky, they had abandoned their homes. They only lost their home that was their shelter in old age. They had somewhere else to go. Many people, I discovered, were still living in these homes. They had mattresses in the center, or someplace that they hoped was less likely to sustain a direct hit that would kill them and their children. As I was being shown around this area, people were coming up to me and smiling at me over and over. They were welcoming me to Palestine, and they were taking me to show me their homes. Children were bringing me, when they saw that I was curious about all the spent bullets around, they were bringing them to me by the handfuls. And as I was going around this area and people were welcoming me and smiling at me, and I was seeing Swiss cheese homes, suddenly there was more gunfire right near me. It wasn't whizzing. We ducked, and they took me out the sort of safe way out of their home and away from the gunfire. As I wrote in an email later, I didn't think these bullets had anything to do with me. It was just a coincidence. Well, later and still, I don't think that was a correct assessment. As I was going around this area, this was the Tufa area of Khan Yunis in Gaza. As I was going around it, I occasionally peeked over sandbag barricades, or very carefully, I promise you, through slits in the shutters, and I could see the Israeli guard towers there, overlooking us. I have no doubt that the Israeli soldiers saw that a foreigner was going around, and they finally decided to send her a message. Don't come here. Don't come to Palestine. Don't tell Americans how their money is being used. This would have fit their pattern. Again, the American media don't tell us that, but Israeli forces shoot, injure, and occasionally kill journalists all the time. Now, they're usually Palestinian journalists. Maybe our media just don't think they count. But some have been German, Italian, British, American. We just don't hear about them. One was a 26-year-old American correspondent for AP. She was shot in the abdomen. It destroyed her spleen and her uterus. I learned this from a British photographer in Gaza. I was skeptical. I'd never heard about that. Well, it turned out he was right. I looked into it. In fact, I even read later that the Israeli military had admitted that she was an American, and they court-martialed the soldier who had done it. Now he has another job, and she has an abdomen missing a spleen and a uterus. If this had been done by Palestinians, it would have been headlines. Why didn't we read about it? In Gaza, I saw beautiful agricultural lands being destroyed. I saw ancient olive groves uprooted. I saw 100-year-old date palms next to the sea that had been flattened. I talked to farmers who had farmed there forever. Their fathers, their great-grandfathers, their great-great, going back sometimes 19 generations or more, had farmed that land, and now they were destroyed. I wondered, what would they do now? How do you feed your family when your farm is destroyed? It occurred to me that when and if they were allowed out of Gaza, and they haven't been, and this was back in 2001, maybe they would join the massive Palestinian day laborers at some point. This is what I saw in Gaza, along the beautiful blue Mediterranean Sea. I saw a people and a land being destroyed. To me, this is newsworthy. I talked to people who were, at this time, at 5 months, had been out of work, were the only ones still working for an extended family of 40. Of course, it's far worse now than it was then, as I just saw on my most recent trip.